Hey there, history enthusiasts. Tonight we're embarking on a journey that will strip away the Hollywood glamour and dive deep into the gritty, brutal, and utterly fascinating reality of ancient Rome. Forget the marble statues and noble senators you've seen in movies. We're talking about a world where your morning routine could kill you. Your dinner might be poisoned and your entertainment involved watching people get torn apart by wild animals. But that's just the beginning. We'll also witness one of history's most shocking assassinations sail across impossible oceans, with Polynesian navigators endure Victorian medical treatments that were worse than the diseases and trace the evolution of the very words you're reading right now. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey through time that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. Because after tonight, you'll understand why you truly wouldn't last a day in ancient Rome. Life as a Roman citizen, a day you'd never survive. Welcome to Rome, circa 100 CE. You've just woken up in your cramped apartment in an insulae, a multi-story tenement building that's essentially an ancient death trap. The year is 100 CE, and you're about to experience what it really means to be a Roman citizen. Your bedroom is a windowless chamber barely large enough for a straw mattress. The walls are thin and you can hear everything, and I mean everything, that your neighbours are doing. The baby upstairs has been crying all night. The couple next door had a screaming match about money, and someone 3 floors up is playing the flute badly. Very badly. You stumble to your feet, immediately regretting it as the floor creaks ominously. Insulae were notorious for collapsing without warning. These weren't sturdy brick buildings. They were hastily constructed wooden and mud brick towers that frequently caught fire or simply fell over. The higher your floor, the cheaper your rent, and the more likely you were to die in a spectacular architectural failure. There's no glass in your window opening, just a wooden shutter that you keep closed to prevent thieves from climbing in. And yes, thieves regularly scaled 6-story buildings to rob apartments. Morning light filters weakly through gaps in the walls. You'd love to linger in bed, but your bladder has other plans. Here's your first problem. There's no bathroom in your apartment. None. 0. If you need to relieve yourself, you have 3 options, each worse than the last. Option 1, stumble down 6 flights of creaky stairs in the dark to use the public latrine on the ground floor. Option 2, use a chamber pot and empty it into the street later. Option 3, stick your rear end out the window and pray the wind isn't blowing the wrong direction. Most Romans went with option 2, which meant carrying a pot full of human waste down 6 flights of stairs and dumping it into the nearest sewer or street. Miss the designated spot and you'd face a fine. Hit a passerby and you'd face their fists. The smell in an insulae wasn't just unpleasant, it was a living, breathing assault on your nostrils. But let's say you're feeling ambitious and decide to make the trek downstairs to the communal latrine. You carefully navigate the rickety wooden stairs, each step threatening to give way. The stairs have no railings, no lighting, and are slick with various substances you'd rather not identify. Finally, you reach the ground floor and the public toilet. It's a simple stone bench with holes cut into it positioned over a flowing channel of water. But here's the thing, it's completely public. No stalls, no privacy, no shame. You sit shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours, conducting conversations while conducting business. Romans saw toilet time as social time. They'd discuss politics, trade gossip, and even conduct business deals while, well, you get the picture. And toilet paper, what's that? Romans used a communal sponge on a stick soaked in salt water or vinegar that was shared by everyone. Yes, the same sponge, the same stick, everyone. Still feeling nostalgic for the good old days. Now that you've survived the bathroom experience, it's time to get cleaned up for the day. But forget about a hot shower or even a cold one. There's no running water in your apartment. If you want to wash yourself, you have a few options, each about as appealing as the last. Option 1. Wet a sponge with water from a clay jar and give yourself a quick wipe down. This water has been sitting in your apartment for who knows how long, growing things that science won't discover for another 1-800 years. Option 2. Pay to use the public baths, assuming you have the money and they're open. Let's say you decide to splurge on the baths. You gather your bathing supplies, a strigil, a curved metal scraper, some oil, and whatever clothes you plan to wear for the day. You head out into the streets of Rome, which is an adventure in itself. The streets are narrow, crowded, and covered in a delightful mixture of mud, human waste, animal droppings, rotting food, and various bodily fluids from both people and animals. There are no sidewalks, so pedestrians share the road with carts, horses, donkeys, and the occasional litter carrying some wealthy Roman who's too important to walk like a commoner. Romans didn't have soap as we know it. Instead, they covered their bodies with oil and then scraped it off with the strigil, supposedly taking dirt and dead skin with it. This process was about as effective as you'd imagine, which is why Romans generally smelled like a mixture of rancid oil, sweat, and whatever they'd stepped in on the way to the baths. If you couldn't afford the public baths, you made do with what you had. Many Romans simply lived with being dirty. Personal hygiene wasn't a high priority, partly because it was so difficult to achieve and partly because everyone was equally filthy, so no one really noticed. Hair care was similarly primitive. Wealthy Romans had elaborate hairstyles held in place with copious amounts of oil and even lead-based cosmetics. Common citizens made do with whatever they could manage. Combs existed, but they were expensive and not particularly effective against the various creatures that made their homes in unwashed hair. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent. Romans did have some tooth-cleaning powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, or even human urine. Yes, really, but these were harsh and often did more damage than good. Most Romans simply accepted that their teeth would rot and fall out as they aged. Bad breath wasn't a social faux pas, it was just part of life. Feeling hungry. Time for breakfast. Roman style. But don't get your hopes up for eggs, Benedict, or fresh orange juice. Roman breakfast, if you could afford it, consisted of bread, olives, cheese, and perhaps some honey if you were lucky. More often it was just bread. Hard, coarse bread that could break your teeth if you weren't careful. The bread wasn't the fluffy, enriched loaves we know today. Roman bread was dense, gritty, and often filled with more than just flour. Bakers regularly added sawdust chalk or even sand to stretch their ingredients further. The wealthy could afford fine white bread made from imported wheat, but common citizens made do with dark, heavy loaves that were more filling than flavorful. Forget about butter or jam to make the bread more palatable. Butter was a luxury that most Romans couldn't afford, and sugar didn't exist in the Roman world. If you wanted to sweeten something, you used honey, which was expensive, or de frutum, a syrup made from boiled-down wine that contained dangerous levels of lead. For protein, you might have some cheese made from goats or sheep's milk. Cow's milk was less common and considered somewhat barbaric by sophisticated Romans. The cheese was often hard salty and frequently crawling with mites or other insects. You ate around them because protein was protein. If you lived near the coast or a river, you might have access to fish sauce called garum. This wasn't a condiment you'd recognize. It was made by allowing fish entrails to ferment in the sun for several months until they formed a pungent, salty liquid. Romans loved the stuff and put it on everything. The smell alone would probably make you vomit. But to Romans, it was the height of culinary sophistication. Water was often unsafe to drink, so many Romans started their day with mulsum, a mixture of wine and honey, or posca, a drink made from sour wine and water. Yes, Romans routinely drank alcohol for breakfast, not because they were alcoholics, but because it was often safer than the water. The wealthy enjoyed exotic foods imported from across the empire. Spices from Asia, fruits from Africa, oysters from Britannia. But for common citizens, the diet was monotonous and often inadequate. Malnutrition was common, particularly among children and the elderly. After your meagre breakfast, it's time to head to work. But forget about a comfortable office job or even a steady trade. In ancient Rome, most people scrambled for whatever work they could find, and job security was about as stable as those insular buildings. If you were lucky enough to have a trade, you might be a baker working before dawn in a stifling hot bakery, breathing in flour dust that would eventually destroy your lungs. Or perhaps you were a fuller processing wool and cloth using human urine to clean the fibers. Yes, you literally spent your days stamping on fabric soaked in piss. The smell never left your clothes or your skin. Maybe you worked in construction, hauling massive stone blocks with nothing but ropes, pulleys, and human muscle. Safety regulations didn't exist. If you fell from scaffolding and broke your leg, you didn't get workers' compensation. You got death or a lifetime of begging on the streets. For many Romans, work meant whatever odd jobs they could find. You might spend the morning delivering messages across the city, the afternoon loading ships at the docks, and the evening serving drinks in a tavern. Payment was irregular, and often barely enough to afford your next meal. Women had even fewer options. Wealthy women weren't expected to work at all, while poor women might work as midwives, wet nurses, or prostitutes. Many worked in their homes, spinning wool or weaving cloth for sale. The work was tedious, poorly paid, and never-ending. Slaves, of course, had no choice in their work. They might be forced into gladiator training, sent to work in mines where they'd die within a few years, or kept as house servants, subject to their owner's every whim. Even well-treated slaves lived in constant fear of being sold beaten or worse. The working day began at dawn and ended at sunset. There was no such thing as a weekend, no paid vacation, no sick leave. You worked because the alternative was starvation. And speaking of work, one of the most popular forms of entertainment in Rome involved watching people work, fighting for their lives in the arena. If you've managed to survive your workday, you might be looking forward to some entertainment. In Rome, that meant the games, gladiator fights, animal hunts, and public executions all rolled into one spectacular display of brutality. The Circus Maximus could hold up to 300,000 spectators, making it larger than any modern stadium. Getting a seat involved arriving before dawn, fighting through crowds, and hoping you didn't get trampled in the process. The wealthy had reserved seating, but common citizens had to scramble for space in the upper tiers. Once inside, you'd be treated to a day-long festival of violence. The morning might feature venazions, staged hunts where exotic animals were slaughtered by professional hunters. Bears, lions, elephants, and even giraffes were imported from across the empire just to be killed for entertainment. The Romans were remarkably efficient at driving species to local extinction. The main event, of course, was the gladiator fights, but forget the noble warriors you've seen in movies. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals fighting for their lives with inferior weapons and minimal armor. They were as likely to die from infections as from sword wounds. The crowd didn't just watch passively. They participated actively, shouting encouragement, booing poor performances, and ultimately deciding whether a defeated gladiator lived or died with a simple thumbs up or down. The emperor had the final say, but he usually followed the crowd's wishes to maintain popular support. Between fights, criminals were executed in increasingly creative ways. They might be crucified, fed to wild animals, or forced to reenact mythological scenes that ended in their deaths. For Romans, watching people die was entertainment, and the more creative the death, the more they enjoyed it. The smell in the arena was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, sweat, animal waste, and 300,000 unwashed bodies sitting in the sun. Vendors sold snacks and drinks much like modern stadiums, but the snacks were often stale bread and watered-down wine sold at inflated prices. If you got thirsty during the games, you might buy some water from a vendor, but you'd be taking your life in your hands. The water was often contaminated, and waterborne diseases spread rapidly through crowds. Many Romans preferred to stick with wine regardless of the time of day. As evening approaches, it's time for the main meal of the day, cena or dinner. If you're wealthy, this means reclining on a couch while slaves bring you course after course of exotic foods. If you're poor, it means whatever you can afford to cook over a small brazier in your apartment. The wealthy Roman dinner party was a carefully orchestrated social event. Guests reclined on couches arranged in a U-shape around low tables. But even the wealthy had to deal with Roman dining customs that would horrify modern diners. There were no forks. You ate with your hands, using bread to soak up sauces and oils. Napkins existed, but many diners simply wiped their hands on their slaves. The food itself was often bizarre by modern standards. Romans loved dishes that combined sweet and savory flavors in what we'd consider revolting ways. Honey-glazed mice, stuffed dormice, and pickled peacock tongues were delicacies. Fish sauce was poured on everything, including desserts made with rose petals and garum. Vomiting during dinner wasn't just acceptable, it was encouraged. The wealthy had special rooms called vomitoria, where guests could purge themselves to make room for more food. The idea of eating until you were sick, making yourself vomit, and then eating more was seen as the height of sophistication. For common citizens, dinner was far simpler and often inadequate. A typical meal might consist of a thick porridge made from grain, some vegetables if they were in season, and perhaps a small piece of meat if you were lucky. Many Romans went to bed hungry because they simply couldn't afford enough food. Cooking in your apartment was dangerous and often illegal. The risk of fire in wooden buildings packed with people was so great that many landlords forbade cooking entirely. This forced many Romans to buy prepared food from street vendors or taverns, which was expensive and often spoiled. Social drinking was common, but the wine was nothing like what we know today. It was often heavily diluted with water and flavored with spices or herbs to mask the taste of spoilage. Pure wine was considered barbaric and was reserved for religious ceremonies or medicinal purposes. As darkness falls over Rome, the city transforms from merely dangerous to absolutely terrifying. There was no street lighting, no police force, and no emergency services. After sunset, Rome belonged to the criminals, the desperate, and the drunk. The streets became hunting grounds for muggers, kidnappers, and worse. Wealthy Romans travelled with armed bodyguards and flaming torches, but even they weren't completely safe. Common citizens simply tried to avoid going out after dark whenever possible. The city's narrow, winding streets became a maze in the darkness. It was easy to get lost even in neighbourhoods you knew well, and getting lost after dark in Rome was often a death sentence. You might stumble into a gang of criminals, fall into an open sewer, or simply collapse from exhaustion and never be found. Fire was a constant threat. With no organised fire department and buildings made largely of wood fires spread rapidly and devastated entire neighbourhoods. The Emperor Nero's Great Fire in 64 CE destroyed more than half the city and left hundreds of thousands homeless. But even if you managed to avoid criminals and fires, your own apartment was trying to kill you. The insulae were so poorly constructed that they regularly collapsed, often without warning. You might go to sleep in a 6-story building and wake up in a pile of rubble, if you woke up at all. The noise was incessant. Romans were loud people living in close quarters with thin walls. Babies cried, couples fought, drunk people sang, and everyone seemed determined to conduct their business at the top of their lungs. Sleep was a precious commodity that most Romans got very little of. If you became ill or injured during the night, you were largely on your own. There were no emergency rooms, no ambulances, no 911 to call. You relied on whatever home remedies you knew, the dubious skills of local physicians or the mercy of the gods. As dawn breaks and you've somehow survived another night in ancient Rome, you might reflect on what you've experienced. You've managed to avoid death by disease, accident, crime, or architectural failure for one whole day. Congratulations, you've beaten the odds. But tomorrow, you'll have to do it all again. And the day after that, and every day until disease, violence, or simple exhaustion finally claims you, probably before your 40th birthday. So, the next time you complain about your morning commute, remember the Roman who had to dodge collapsing buildings, human waste, and armed criminals just to get to work. When you're annoyed by a noisy neighbour, think of the Roman trying to sleep while an entire tenement building partied around them. Ancient Rome was undoubtedly one of history's greatest civilizations, but it was also a place where daily life was a constant struggle against death in a dozen different forms. You wouldn't last a day in ancient Rome, and honestly, you wouldn't want to. Part 2. The Ides of March, Caesar's Fatal Day. The pre-dawn darkness of March 15th, 44 BCE, hung heavy over Rome like a funeral shroud. In his modest home on the Palatine Hill, Gaius Julius Caesar stirred in his bed, perhaps troubled by dreams, or simply by the weight of empire that pressed upon his shoulders even in sleep. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours the Roman Republic would die with him on the Senate floor. Caesar's morning began like many others, but the city around him seemed charged with an unusual energy. His wife Calpurnia had spent a restless night plagued by nightmares. In her dreams, she had seen the roof of their house collapse and her husband lying bloody in her arms. Roman culture placed great importance on dreams as messages from the gods, and Calpurnia's terror was palpable as she begged Caesar not to leave the house. But the signs had been accumulating for weeks. Soothsayers had warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Mysterious birds had appeared in the forum, crying out in strange tongues. Lightning had struck Jupiter's temple, and the sacred chickens, yes, Romans consulted chickens about important decisions, had refused to eat, a terrible omen for any significant undertaking. Adding to the ominous atmosphere, there were more concrete warnings. A slave had approached Caesar in the street days earlier, pressing a note into his hands that supposedly contained details of the assassination plot. Caesar had been so busy greeting supporters and dealing with petitioners that he'd never read the warning, instead adding it to the bundle of scrolls carried by his secretaries. As Caesar prepared for the day, his personal physician strongly advised against going to the Senate. The dictator had been suffering from what may have been epileptic seizures, though Romans called it the sacred disease, believing it to be a mark of divine favour rather than a medical condition. He had been feeling unwell for days, and his doctor feared the stress of a Senate session might trigger another episode. Even Caesar's guards seemed nervous. They had heard whispers in taverns and back alleys, rumours that something was being planned. The Praetorian Guard, normally confident and alert, moved with unusual tension as they prepared for another day of protecting the most powerful man in the world. a man who insisted on making himself accessible to the people regardless of the danger. While Caesar contemplated the omens across the city, dozens of conspirators made their final preparations. They called themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators, believing they were saving the Republic from tyranny. Led by Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar loved like a son, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, whose hatred for Caesar burned like a cold flame, they had spent months planning this moment. The conspiracy was surprisingly large. Over 60 senators were involved to some degree. This wasn't a small cabal of malcontents. It was a significant portion of Rome's political elite united in their determination to stop Caesar from becoming king. Many genuinely believed they were preserving the Roman Republic, while others were motivated by personal grievances or simple jealousy of Caesar's power. The conspirators had chosen the location carefully. The Senate was meeting that day in the Theatre of Pompey, ironic, since Caesar had built his career partly on the defeat of Pompey in civil war. The theatre housed a temporary Senate house while the Curia Julia was under renovation. More symbolically, a statue of Pompey looked down on the meeting place. The defeated rival would witness Caesar's downfall. Each conspirator carried a dagger hidden beneath his toga. They had rehearsed their roles carefully. Some would create distractions, others would block exits, and the core group would surround Caesar when the moment arrived. They had agreed that each must strike a blow to share responsibility for the deed. No one man would be solely responsible for killing Caesar. The conspirators had to be careful about their behavior. Any unusual nervousness or suspicious gathering might alert Caesar's many supporters throughout the city. They went about their normal morning routines, attending to family matters, receiving clients, and conducting business as if this were just another day in the Republic. Some conspirators were having second thoughts. Brutus himself had struggled with the decision for months. Caesar had been like a father to him, had promoted his career, and had shown him nothing but kindness. But Brutus's ancestors had helped found the Republic by overthrowing the last king, and family honor demanded he protect republican institutions from monarchical ambitions. Despite all the warnings and omens, Caesar decided to attend the Senate session. He had worked too hard to consolidate his power to show weakness now by hiding from shadows and rumors. The Roman people expected their leaders to be brave, and Caesar's courage had built his legend from Gaul to Egypt. As his litter-bearers prepared to carry him through the streets of Rome, Caesar might have reflected on how far he had come. Born into a patrician but not particularly wealthy family, he had climbed the ladder of Roman politics through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and enormous personal charisma. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, and ruled Egypt through his relationship with Cleopatra. The journey to the theatre of Pompey took Caesar through the heart of Rome. The streets were busy with the usual morning crowds, slaves carrying water from public fountains, merchants setting up their stalls, officials hurrying to their duties. Citizens who recognized the dictator called out greetings and blessings, unaware they were witnessing his final journey. As the litter passed through the Forum Romanum, Caesar could see the massive construction projects that would bear his name for millennia. The Forum Julium, the Basilica, Julia, the Curia, Julia, all monuments to his glory and his vision of Rome's future. He was building not just in stone and marble, but in law and governance, creating institutions that would outlast any individual ruler. Near the theatre, Caesar encountered the soothsayer Spurina, who had previously warned him about the Ides of March. "Well, the Ides of March have come," Caesar said, perhaps with a slight smile. "Aye, they have come, but they have not yet passed," replied the prophet darkly. Caesar laughed and continued on his way, but perhaps the exchange gave him a moment's pause. As Caesar's litter approached the theatre of Pompey, the conspirators inside were growing nervous. Some had already taken their positions in the Senate house, while others waited outside to ensure that Caesar actually arrived. There had been rumors that he might cancel the session due to his wife's dreams or his own illness. The atmosphere inside the makeshift Senate house was tense, though most senators were unaware of what was about to unfold. The conspirators had arranged for a large number of gladiators owned by Decimus Brutus to be positioned nearby ostensibly for games, but really to prevent Caesar's supporters from interfering once the deed was done. The Senate session was called to order, with the usual rituals and ceremonies. Caesar took his place in the golden chair that served as his seat of honor, elevated above the other senators. From this position he could see most of the assembly, but he could not see behind him where some of the conspirators had positioned themselves. The first item of business was a petition from a senator named Lucius Tullius Cimber asking for the recall of his exiled brother. This was the signal. As Cimber approached Caesar with his petition, other conspirators began to gather around ostensibly to support the request, but actually to get into position for the attack. Mark Antony Caesar's loyal supporter and co-consul had been deliberately detained outside the theatre by Trebonius, one of the conspirators. This ensured that Caesar's most capable ally would not be present to defend him or rally his supporters during the crucial moments that followed. Caesar initially listened to Cimber's petition with the air of someone conducting routine business. But as more and more senators pressed around him supposedly to add their voices to the request, he became suspicious. When he tried to stand, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it from his shoulders, another signal to the conspirators. "This is violence," Caesar cried out, realizing that something was terribly wrong. But it was too late. Servilius Casca struck the first blow, slashing at Caesar's neck with his dagger. The wound was shallow, Casca was nervous, and the angle was awkward, but Caesar's blood had been drawn. What followed was a frenzy of violence that lasted only minutes but would echo through history for millennia. Caesar fought back at first, grabbing Casca's hand and stabbing him with his stylus, the pointed writing implement that was his only weapon. But as more conspirators pressed forward with their daggers, resistance became impossible. The senators not involved in the plot fled in terror, some thinking that all of them were to be killed. In the confusion, several conspirators wounded each other in their eagerness to strike Caesar. Blood flowed not just from the dictator, but from his assassins as well. Caesar continued to struggle until he saw Brutus among his attackers. According to some accounts, he spoke his final words in Greek. "Kai su teknon," "You, too, my child." Though the famous Latin phrase "et tu brute" was Shakespeare's invention, the sentiment captures the historical accounts of Caesar's heartbreak at seeing his beloved protégé among his killers. Recognizing that resistance was futile and that even Brutus had betrayed him, Caesar stopped fighting. He wrapped his toga around his head, both to preserve some dignity and to hide his face from the blows that followed. In a final gesture of defiance or despair, he made sure his body fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling at the feet of his old rival. When the violence ended, Caesar's body bore 23 wounds. According to the physician who examined him afterward, only one wound would have been fatal, a thrust to the heart. The conspirators had indeed shared the responsibility for his death as planned, but their frenzied attack had been far from the clean, dignified execution they might have envisioned. In the moments after Caesar's death, an eerie silence fell over the theatre of Pompey. The conspirators stood over the body, their daggers still dripping with blood, suddenly uncertain about what came next. They had succeeded in killing Caesar, but they had no immediate plan for controlling the aftermath of their action. Brutus attempted to address the remaining senators, proclaiming that the Republic had been saved from tyranny, but his words fell on mostly empty benches. The non-conspirator senators had fled in panic, and even some of the conspirators were having second thoughts about what they had done. Outside the theatre, the news of Caesar's assassination spread like wildfire through the streets of Rome. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Some citizens, particularly the poor who had benefited from Caesar's largesse, were outraged and began calling for vengeance. Others, especially among the traditional nobility, celebrated quietly, hoping that the Republic would indeed be restored. The conspirators had gravely underestimated Caesar's popularity with the common people. They had assumed that removing the dictator would automatically restore Republican government, but they failed to recognize that Caesar's supporters would not simply accept his death and return to business as usual. Mark Antony, realizing what had happened, disguised himself as a slave and fled to his house, expecting that the conspirators might come for him next. Other Caesarian leaders went into hiding, unsure whether the assassination was part of a broader purge of Caesar's supporters. The city began to descend into chaos. Angry crowds gathered in the forum, demanding explanations and calling for justice. The conspirators, still believing they could control events, prepared to address the people directly, confident that their actions would be vindicated once Romans understood their noble motives. The 3 days following Caesar's assassination saw Rome transform from the capital of a stable empire into a city on the brink of civil war. The conspirators had killed Caesar, but had no plan for governing the empire they claimed to have saved. Their idealistic belief that the Republic would simply resume functioning as it had before Caesar revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how completely the Roman system had changed. The reading of Caesar's will proved to be a masterstroke of political theatre even in death. Caesar had left significant sums of money to every Roman citizen and donated his private gardens to the public. This generosity from beyond the grave contrasted sharply with the conspirators' failure to offer any concrete benefits to the people whose republic they claimed to represent. Mark Antony's funeral oration over Caesar's body inflamed popular sentiment against the conspirators. Unlike Shakespeare's version, Antony didn't need to be subtle or ironic. He openly condemned the assassination as murder and called for vengeance. When he displayed Caesar's bloody toga showing the crowd each tear made by the conspirators' daggers, the mob's fury reached a fever pitch. That night, Rome burned. Angry citizens dragged furniture and wood from their homes to build a funeral pyre for Caesar in the Forum. The fire burned so hot that it damaged surrounding buildings. Some tried to drag the conspirators from their homes to burn them alive, forcing Brutus Cassius and their allies to flee the city they thought they had liberated. Within weeks, the conspiracy began to unravel. The conspirators found themselves isolated, lacking support from both the people and most of the Senate. They had assassinated Caesar, but had no answer for the question of what came next. The republic they sought to restore was already dead. They had simply made its death violent and public. Mark Antony moved quickly to consolidate power, but he too would soon discover that Caesar's death had not ended the era of strongmen. Young Octavian Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir would prove to be every bit as ambitious and far more ruthless than his predecessor. The conspirators had killed Caesar to save the Republic, but their actions would ultimately lead to its final transformation into the empire under Augustus. The Ides of March became synonymous with betrayal and the unintended consequences of political violence. Caesar's assassination demonstrated that killing a leader does not necessarily kill their ideas or their influence. If anything, Caesar's legend grew stronger in death than it had been in life, inspiring both his supporters and future autocrats who would invoke his name and memory. The man who had once said, "I came, I saw, I conquered," had been conquered himself, but his death would conquer the republic that his assassins sought to preserve. In trying to prevent Caesar from becoming king, the conspirators had instead paved the way for the emperors who would rule for the next 500 years. As night fell on March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar's body lay cold in his home, but his blood continued to cry out from the theatre of Pompey. The Republic was dead killed not by Caesar's ambition, but by the knives of those who claimed to be its saviours. The Ides of March had come and gone, and Rome would never be the same. Part 3, Masters of the Open Ocean, Polynesian Navigation. Imagine standing on a beach in Tahiti over 1,000 years ago, watching as a single canoe disappears over the horizon. The crew carries no compass, no GPS, no maps. They have only the stars, the waves, and knowledge passed down through generations of navigators. Their destination islands they've never seen scattered across thousands of miles of empty Pacific Ocean. This wasn't a desperate flight or a lucky accident. This was precision navigation that would make modern sailors weep with inadequacy. Long before Europeans stumbled across the Americas or Columbus got lost looking for India, Polynesian navigators had mastered the largest ocean on Earth. Between roughly 1000 BCE and 1300 CE, these maritime masters spread from Taiwan to Easter Island, covering a third of the planet's surface. They did this without metal tools, without written language, and without any of the navigation instruments that Europeans considered essential for ocean travel. The scale of this migration is staggering. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 165 million square kilometers, larger than all land masses combined. Yet Polynesian navigators found and settled islands separated by thousands of miles of open water, many of them mere specks barely visible from sea level. Easter Island. The most remote inhabited land on Earth lies over 2,000 miles from the nearest populated island. Finding it by accident would be like throwing a dart at a map while blindfolded and hitting a pencil point. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing disaster as some early European scholars assumed. Archaeological evidence shows that Polynesian expansion was deliberate, planned, and incredibly successful. They carried with them pigs, dogs, chickens, and crops like taro and breadfruit. They brought everything needed to establish thriving communities on previously uninhabited islands. This was colonization with precision and forethought that rivals any modern space mission. The vessels they used were technological marvels perfectly adapted to their purpose. Polynesian voyaging canoes called wa'akaulua in Hawaiian weren't the primitive dugouts that Europeans imagined. They were sophisticated, double-hulled vessels connected by a platform providing stability in rough seas and space for supplies and passengers. Some of these canoes stretched over 100 feet in length and could carry entire communities across the ocean. But most impressive of all was the navigation itself. While European sailors hugged coastlines and feared the open ocean, Polynesian navigators deliberately sought out the deep blue water where navigation was purest and most precise. They had developed a system of wayfinding so sophisticated that European naval officers, when they finally encountered it, initially refused to believe it was possible. To understand Polynesian navigation, you must forget everything you think you know about finding your way across water. These navigators didn't just read the stars, they read the ocean itself. Every wave, every swell, every change in water colour or temperature told a story to those who knew how to listen. The ocean, far from being a featureless expanse, was to Polynesian navigators a readable landscape full of highways and landmarks. Ocean swells, long regular waves generated by distant storms or trade wind, provided consistent directional reference points. A master navigator could identify 4 or 5 different swell patterns simultaneously tracking how they interacted with islands hundreds of miles away. When swells encounter an island, they create interference patterns that a trained navigator can detect from remarkable distances. Land causes swells to bend around it, creating a distinctive wave pattern called talapa that extends for dozens of miles beyond the island itself. Experienced navigators could feel an island's presence through these subtle changes in wave motion, often while the land was still far below the horizon. Picture yourself lying in the bottom of a canoe, eyes closed, feeling every subtle movement of the vessel through the water. To an untrained person, it's just rocking motion. But to a master navigator, each shift tells a story. The canoe lifts differently when approaching the wave shadow of a distant island. It responds uniquely to the interference patterns created when ocean swells wrap around land masses. These navigators could literally feel their way to islands they couldn't see. But wave patterns were just one element in a complex navigation system. Polynesian navigators tracked clouds which behave differently over land and water. Clouds over islands tend to be stationary and often have a distinctive shape or colour caused by reflected light from beaches or lagoons. The navigator might spot a green tinge in distant clouds indicating reflection from the shallow waters of an atoll's lagoon, or notice how clouds seem to pile up over invisible land. Wildlife provided another layer of navigational information. Certain seabirds fly out to sea each morning and return to land each evening, creating reliable bearing indicators when you're within flight range of an island. Dolphins and whales follow predictable migration routes. Even floating debris, palm fronds, pieces of coral or logs, could indicate the direction and distance to land. The navigators also paid attention to watercolour and phosphorescence. Deep ocean water appears a different shade of blue than the shallower waters around islands. At night, the wake of the canoe would glow with the phosphorescent organisms, and the patterns of this glow could reveal underwater currents and obstacles. Imagine sailing through liquid starlight where every stroke of the paddle creates trails of biological fire that point the way home. While the ocean provided constant navigation cues during the day, nighttime belonged to the stars. Polynesian celestial navigation was incredibly sophisticated, based on detailed knowledge of star positions, movements, and rising and setting points accumulated over generations. Rather than using individual stars as reference points, Polynesian navigators memorized star paths, sequences of stars that rose and set in specific directions. They knew exactly where hundreds of stars would appear on the horizon at different times of night and year. A navigator could determine his direction by observing which stars were rising in the east or setting in the west. The navigators divided the horizon into a compass of 32 directional points, each marked by specific stars. They could navigate to within a few degrees of accuracy using these stellar references. But this system required phenomenal memory and years of training. A master navigator had to memorize the behavior of stars throughout the year, compensation for seasonal variations, and the complex interactions between stellar and oceanic navigation cues. Think about what this means. These navigators carried in their minds a three-dimensional map of the night sky that changed with the seasons, the time of night, and their position on Earth. They knew not just where stars appeared, but how their positions shifted as the canoe moved across the ocean. They could track their progress by comparing the actual positions of stars with where they should be at specific times and locations. One of the most remarkable aspects of Polynesian navigation was their ability to maintain course during cloudy weather. When stars weren't visible, they relied entirely on ocean swells, wind patterns, and other environmental cues. They could sail for days without seeing the sky and still arrive precisely at their intended destination. The training of a navigator began in childhood and continued for decades. Young apprentices learned to feel the motion of different swells while lying on their backs in canoes. They memorized star positions, wave patterns, and the behavior of winds and currents around every known island. They studied weather signs, bird behavior, and the subtle changes in water that indicated proximity to land. Only a few individuals in each generation possessed the combination of memory sensitivity and intuition required to become master navigators. These Palu were revered figures in Polynesian society, holding knowledge that could mean the difference between reaching new lands and dying at sea. The canoes themselves were far more than mere transportation. They were living entities that formed partnerships with their navigators. Polynesian voyaging canoes were engineering marvels, perfectly adapted to long ocean journeys, but they were also spiritual vessels that embodied the relationship between humans and the sea. Double-hulled designs provided stability that single-hulled vessels couldn't match, while the platform between the hulls offered space for people, supplies, and livestock. The hulls were deep enough to cut through waves efficiently, but shallow enough to beach easily on coral shores. These vessels could maintain speeds of 15 to 20 knots in good conditions, faster than most European ships of the era. Construction required no metal tools. Everything was done with stone adzes, shell scrapers, and coral files. The hulls were carved from single trees or built up from planks sewn together with coconut fiber rope. Every joint was carefully sealed with a mixture of breadfruit sap and coconut fiber to keep the vessel watertight. The building of a voyaging canoe was a community effort that could take years. Master craftsmen supervised every aspect of construction, from selecting trees with the proper grain to timing building phases with favorable weather and spiritual conditions. The wood itself was considered sacred. Certain trees were believed to possess spiritual qualities that would protect the vessel and its crew. Picture the entire village participating in the construction, men felling massive trees in sacred groves, women weaving sails from pandanus leaves, children helping to gather materials. Every person had a role in creating these magnificent vessels. The launching of a completed canoe was a celebration that could last for days, with elaborate ceremonies blessing the vessel for its future voyages. The sails were woven from pandanus leaves into triangular shapes that could catch wind from multiple directions. Unlike European square sails that worked best with following winds, Polynesian sails allowed the vessels to sail closer to the wind direction, providing greater flexibility in navigation. These voyaging canoes could carry remarkable loads, sometimes 20 or more people plus supplies for months at sea. They transported not just people but entire ecosystems. Pigs, dogs, chickens, taro plants, coconuts, breadfruit, bananas, and dozens of other species that would establish new populations on distant islands. The relationship between navigator and canoe was deeply personal. Navigators often spent years with a particular vessel, learning its unique characteristics and developing an intimate understanding of how it moved through different sea conditions. They could detect structural problems, changes in loading, or shifts in performance through subtle changes in the canoe's behavior. The actual voyages undertaken by Polynesian navigators were epic undertakings that pushed human endurance and skill to their limits. These weren't casual day trips, but months-long expeditions across thousands of miles of open ocean with no guarantee of finding land. Preparation for a major voyage took months or even years. Communities had to build suitable canoes, gather supplies for extended journeys, and train crew members in the skills needed for ocean travel. Every aspect of the voyage was carefully planned, from the route to take to the timing of departure. The supplies needed were carefully calculated. Fresh water was stored in gourds and bamboo containers, rationed to last the entire journey. Food consisted mainly of dried fish, fermented breadfruit paste, coconuts, and sweet potatoes that could survive the voyage. Live pigs and chickens provided fresh protein and breeding stock for new settlements. The crew of a voyaging canoe had to work together with perfect coordination. The navigator guided the vessel, but everyone had roles to play: managing sails, bailing water, caring for livestock, preparing food, and maintaining constant vigilance for signs of land or danger. Life aboard a voyaging canoe was challenging in the extreme. Space was limited, with every inch carefully allocated for people, supplies, or livestock. Fresh water was rationed strictly, and salt spray constantly drenched everything. Sleep came in short shifts, with someone always on watch. The psychological pressure was enormous. Weeks could pass without seeing any sign of land, with nothing but endless ocean in every direction. Crew members had to maintain faith in their navigators' abilities and resist the panic that could arise from being so far from any known shore. Imagine the courage required to sail beyond the horizon, trusting completely in human knowledge and skill. Weather added another layer of difficulty. Tropical storms could appear suddenly, threatening to swamp the canoe or blow it far off course. Navigators had to quickly assess changing conditions and adjust their route accordingly, all while maintaining their sense of direction and position. The moment when land was finally sighted was one of tremendous relief and celebration. But the voyage wasn't over. The crew still had to navigate safely to shore, find a suitable landing site, and establish themselves on what was often an uninhabited island. Some voyages ended in failure. Canoes were lost at sea, overcome by storms, or simply unable to find land before supplies ran out. But the successes were remarkable enough to populate an entire ocean basin, establishing thriving communities on islands separated by vast distances. What made these navigators truly extraordinary wasn't just their technical knowledge, but their ability to synthesize countless environmental cues into a coherent understanding of their position and destination. They developed what can only be described as a sixth sense for the ocean, an intuitive connection with the marine environment that went beyond mere observation. Master navigators could detect subtle changes in water temperature that indicated different currents. They knew that certain smells carried on the wind meant land was near. The scent of flowers cooking fires or even bird guano could guide them to islands still below the horizon. They understood the relationship between different types of clouds and the islands that created them. Cumulonimbus clouds often formed over high volcanic islands in the afternoon. Stationary lenticular clouds revealed trade wind patterns affected by land masses. Even the absence of clouds could indicate nearby land if the sky appeared different than expected for open ocean. The navigators also paid attention to reflected waves, swells that had bounced off distant shores and returned to create complex interference patterns. By reading these wave signatures, experienced navigators could determine not just the direction to land, but sometimes even the size and shape of distant islands. Perhaps most remarkably, some navigators claimed they could sense the presence of land through what they called the feel of the place. They described subtle changes in the atmosphere, the quality of light, or the behavior of the sea that indicated proximity to shores. While this might sound mystical, it likely represented their ability to detect environmental cues too subtle for conscious recognition. Finding new islands required systematic search patterns based on careful observation of environmental signs. Polynesian navigators didn't simply sail randomly, hoping to stumble across land. They used sophisticated techniques to maximize their chances of discovery. One approach was to follow migrating seabirds, particularly species known to return to land at specific times of day or year. By calculating flight speeds and times, navigators could estimate distances to potential islands and plan their searches accordingly. Another technique involved detecting the island effect, the way landmasses affect local weather patterns. Islands create their own wind systems, generate specific cloud formations, and influence wave patterns in predictable ways. Experienced navigators could detect these signatures from great distances. The navigators also understood that islands often occur in chains or groups. Finding one island could lead to the discovery of others nearby. They mapped these relationships in their minds, creating mental archipelagos that guided future voyages. Seasonal factors played important roles in island finding. Certain times of year offered better visibility, more reliable winds, or clearer atmospheric conditions that made distant land easier to detect. Navigators timed their exploratory voyages to take advantage of these optimal conditions. When returning from a successful island discovery, navigators had to create new sailing directions for future voyages. This required establishing the relationships between the new land and known navigation references, star positions, wind patterns, and wave signatures that would guide others to the same destination. The great age of Polynesian voyaging gradually came to an end around 1300 CE. By this time, virtually all habitable islands in the Pacific had been discovered and settled. The motivation for long-distance exploration diminished as populations stabilized and island communities became more self-sufficient. European contact in the 16th, 18th centuries marked the final end of traditional voyaging. European diseases devastated Polynesian populations, while colonial governments and Christian missionaries actively suppressed traditional practices. Navigation knowledge passed down orally for generations began to disappear as the old masters died without finding worthy apprentices. By the mid-20th century, traditional Polynesian navigation was nearly extinct. Only a few elderly navigators in remote areas still possessed complete knowledge of the ancient techniques. The skills that had populated an ocean seemed destined to vanish forever. But then came an extraordinary revival. In 1976, the voyaging canoe Hokulea completed a journey from Hawaii to Tahiti using only traditional navigation methods. Guided by Maupiailug. A master navigator from the Caroline Islands, the vessel proved that ancient techniques could still achieve remarkable precision across vast distances. This success sparked a renaissance of traditional navigation throughout the Pacific. New voyaging canoes were built, training programs established, and young people began learning the ancient arts. Organizations in Hawaii, Tahiti, New Zealand, and other Pacific islands now maintain active voyaging programs that blend traditional knowledge with modern safety practices. The revival of Polynesian navigation represents more than just historical curiosity. It demonstrates the enduring relevance of indigenous knowledge systems and the importance of maintaining connections with traditional ways of understanding and interacting with the natural world. Today, as we navigate using GPS satellites and computer systems, the achievements of Polynesian wayfinders remind us of the extraordinary capabilities of the human mind and senses. They show us that technology, while useful, is not the only path to mastery of our environment. The Polynesian navigators achieved something that no modern technology has replicated: a holistic understanding of the ocean environment that integrated astronomy, oceanography, meteorology, biology, and intuition into a single system of wayfinding. They demonstrate that humans properly trained and attuned to their environment can achieve remarkable feats using nothing but observation, memory, and skill. Their legacy extends beyond navigation to broader questions about human potential, environmental awareness, and the relationship between technology and traditional knowledge. In an age of climate change and environmental degradation, the Polynesian model of sustainable exploration offers valuable lessons. The navigators of Polynesia didn't conquer the ocean, they partnered with it. They didn't fight against natural forces, but learned to work with them. They achieved their remarkable migrations not through dominance over their environment, but through deep understanding and respect for the sea that sustained them. From Taiwan to Easter Island, from New Zealand to Hawaii, the descendants of these master navigators continue to honor their ancestral achievements. Modern voyaging canoes still cross the Pacific using traditional methods, proving that the ancient skills remain relevant in the contemporary world. The Polynesian navigators were the greatest explorers in human history. Long before Columbus, before Magellan, before any European set foot on a ship, Pacific Islanders had mastered the largest ocean on Earth. They found islands separated by thousands of miles of water with precision that rivals modern technology. They populated an ocean basin 1/3 the size of the planet using nothing but human knowledge, skill, and courage. They were the ultimate masters of the open ocean, guided by stars, waves, winds, and an unshakable faith in their ability to find their way across the vast waters of our blue planet. Their legacy reminds us that the most sophisticated navigation system ever created was not made of silicon and satellites, but of human wisdom passed down through generations of seagoing peoples who dared to sail beyond the horizon and find new worlds waiting in the endless blue. Part 4, Victorian Medicine, when the cure was worse than the disease. Picture this. You're living in Victorian England, the age of progress and prosperity. Steam trains thunder across the countryside. Gas lamps illuminate city streets, and the British Empire spans the globe. Surely medical science has advanced beyond the barbaric practices of earlier eras. Think again. Welcome to an age where cocaine was a cough medicine, radioactive water was considered healthy, and a trip to the doctor was more likely to kill you than cure you. Victorian physicians practiced what they called heroic medicine, an apt term considering you had to be heroic to survive it. The basic principle was simple: if a little treatment was good, a lot was better. If the patient wasn't getting better, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. The result was an arsenal of treatments that would horrify modern patients and, frankly, probably hasten more deaths than they prevented. The foundation of Victorian medicine rested on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, illness resulted from an imbalance of these humours, and the doctor's job was to restore balance through various forms of purging, draining, and violent intervention. Never mind that this theory was over 2,000 years old and based on no scientific evidence whatsoever. It had worked for the Greeks, had it, so it would work for the Victorians. Bloodletting remained one of the most popular treatments throughout the Victorian era. Doctors believed that many ailments resulted from having too much blood, and the solution was obvious: remove the excess. They accomplished this through various methods, each more unpleasant than the last. Sometimes they used lancets to cut veins. Sometimes they applied leeches to suck blood directly, and sometimes they used spring-loaded devices called scarificators that made multiple cuts simultaneously. The amounts of blood removed were shocking by modern standards. A typical bloodletting session might remove a pint or more of blood. In severe cases, patients might lose several pints. Pregnant women, children, and elderly patients all received the same treatment. Many patients who might have recovered from their original ailments died from the blood loss inflicted by their doctors. But bloodletting was just the beginning. Victorian physicians also believed in purging the body through violent induced vomiting and explosive diarrhea. They used powerful drugs like calomel mercury chloride, which caused severe gastrointestinal distress, and tartar emetic antimony compounds, which induced violent vomiting. Patients were often left severely dehydrated and weakened by these treatments. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a horror show of dangerous and ineffective drugs. Many of these substances would be considered lethal poisons today, but Victorian doctors prescribed them routinely for common ailments. The fact that these drugs often made patients worse was attributed to the disease fighting back, not to the toxicity of the treatment. Mercury was perhaps the most widely used toxic medication. Doctors prescribed mercury compounds for everything from syphilis to teething in babies. Calomel. The most common mercury preparation was given in massive doses that caused mercury poisoning, characterized by loose teeth, excessive salivation, kidney damage, and neurological problems. The phrase "mad as a hatter" originated from hat makers who suffered mercury poisoning from mercury compounds used in hat making, but doctors seemed oblivious to the connection. Opium was another staple of Victorian medicine used to treat everything from headaches to hysteria. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was sold over the counter and used as casually as aspirin today. Victorian children were regularly given opium-based preparations to keep them quiet, leading to widespread addiction and countless overdose deaths. Soothing syrups for teething babies contained significant amounts of opium and killed thousands of infants. Cocaine became extremely popular in the late Victorian era after being isolated from coca leaves. It was marketed as a cure for depression, fatigue, toothaches, and dozens of other ailments. Cocaine-laced wines, tonics, and even soft drinks were widely available. Famous figures like Sigmund Freud enthusiastically promoted cocaine, claiming it was a miracle cure for morphine addiction, apparently unaware that it was equally addictive. Arsenic, now known to be a deadly poison, was prescribed for a variety of ailments, including skin conditions, anemia, and general debility. Victorian women often took arsenic compounds to improve their complexions, not realizing they were slowly poisoning themselves. Arsenic was also a popular ingredient in tonics marketed to both men and women. Even more bizarre were some of the organic remedies. Victorian doctors prescribed human skulls ground into powder for epilepsy, dried viper's flesh for skin diseases, and various preparations made from human blood and body parts. Cannibalism in the name of medicine was not uncommon, though it was usually dressed up in scientific terminology. Surgery in the Victorian era was a traumatic experience that patients avoided at all costs. Before the introduction of anesthesia in the 1840s, surgery was performed on fully conscious patients who were simply held down by strong men while the surgeon worked as quickly as possible. Even after anesthesia became available, many surgeons were reluctant to use it, believing that pain was necessary for healing or that anesthetics were too dangerous. The lack of understanding about germs and infection made surgery incredibly dangerous. Surgeons operated in their street clothes using instruments that hadn't been sterilized. They often sharpened their tools on their boots and wiped their hands on sawdust-covered floors between operations. The mortality rate from surgery was astronomical, with many patients dying from infection days or weeks after surviving the operation itself. Amputations were common because doctors didn't know how to treat infections in limbs. A patient with a broken leg that became infected would likely have the entire leg removed. These operations were performed without proper antiseptic techniques, often leading to fatal infections anyway. The famous surgeon James Syme was known as the Napoleon of surgery partly because of his speed in amputation. He could remove a leg at the hip in 90 seconds. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was still practiced for head injuries, mental illness and severe headaches. Victorian surgeons would use hand-cranked drills to bore into patients' skulls, often without any anaesthetic. Many patients died from brain infections following these procedures. Caesarean sections were almost uniformly fatal for mothers, with mortality rates approaching 100% in some hospitals. The combination of blood loss, infection and shock killed virtually every woman who underwent the procedure. Doctors rarely attempted caesarean sections unless the mother was already dying or dead. Even minor surgical procedures were dangerous. Tooth extractions often led to serious infections. Cataract surgery performed without anesthetics or antiseptic techniques frequently resulted in blindness or death. Many patients who might have survived their original ailments died from the complications of Victorian surgical interventions. Victorian medicine was also obsessed with various pseudo-scientific treatments that promised miraculous cures through natural means. Hydrotherapy, or the water cure, became enormously popular in the mid-Victorian era. Patients flocked to special water cure establishments where they were subjected to various forms of water torture in the name of health. The water cure involved a bewildering array of treatments. Patients might be wrapped in cold wet sheets and left for hours, forced to drink enormous quantities of water, subjected to high-pressure water jets, or immersed in ice-cold baths for extended periods. Some treatments involved alternating between extremely hot and cold water. Patients often emerged from these treatments weaker than when they started, but the doctors attributed any worsening of condition to the body expelling toxins. Electrotherapy was another Victorian medical fad that caused more harm than good. Doctors used primitive electrical devices to send shocks through patients' bodies, believing that electricity could cure everything from depression to paralysis. These early electrical machines were dangerous and unpredictable, often delivering far more current than intended. Patients were regularly burned or electrocuted during these treatments. One popular form of electrotherapy involved inserting electrical probes into various body cavities. Rectal electrotherapy was commonly used for digestive ailments, while vaginal electrotherapy was prescribed for female hysteria. These invasive procedures were painful, embarrassing, and often led to serious injuries or infections. Some Victorian doctors even experimented with deliberately infecting patients with malaria to treat other diseases, reasoning that the high fever would burn out the original infection. This practice, called pyrotherapy, was particularly popular for treating syphilis. Many patients died from the induced malaria rather than their original disease. The Victorian era saw an explosion in patent medicines, over-the-counter remedies that promised to cure everything from consumption to baldness. These concoctions were heavily advertised in newspapers and sold by travelling salesmen, druggists, and general stores. Most contained alcohol, opium, cocaine, or other dangerous substances as their active ingredients. Bitters were among the most popular patent medicines marketed as tonics for general health and vitality. These preparations typically contained 40 to 60% alcohol, along with various herbs and sometimes cocaine or opium. People who bought bitters thinking they were taking medicine often became unknowing alcoholics. Women's medicines were particularly lucrative because Victorian society restricted women's access to regular medical care. Female regulators promised to cure menstrual problems, while hysteria treatments claimed to calm nervous women. Most of these contained significant amounts of opium or alcohol, which provided temporary relief from symptoms but created addiction problems. Children's medicines were especially dangerous because parents trusted that anything marketed for babies must be safe. Teething powders often contained mercury, while colic remedies were loaded with opium. Soothing syrups killed countless infants through opium overdoses, but grieving parents attributed the deaths to sudden infant death or the divine will, rather than the medicine itself. Some patent medicines made incredibly bold claims. Snake oil salesmen promised their products could cure cancer, restore youth, and even raise the dead. These fraudulent cures preyed on desperate people who couldn't afford real medical care. Not that real medical care was necessarily better. The lack of regulation meant that patent medicine manufacturers could put anything in their products and make any claims they wanted. The only requirement was that they pay a small tax on the medicine, which is how they became known as patent medicines. Victorian medicine was also influenced by various pseudosciences that claimed to diagnose and treat illness through non-medical means. Phrenology, the study of skull shape and size, was enormously popular throughout the Victorian era. Phrenologists claimed they could determine a person's character, intelligence, and mental health by examining the bumps and contours of their head. Phrenological examinations were considered serious medical assessments. Patients would have their heads measured and mapped, with phrenologists identifying areas that supposedly corresponded to different personality traits and mental faculties. Based on these examinations, phrenologists prescribed treatments ranging from cold water applications to wearing special hats designed to reshape the skull. Some phrenologists even performed surgery claiming they could improve personality or intelligence by altering the shape of the skull. These operations were dangerous and usually pointless, as skull shape has no relationship to personality or mental capacity. Mesmerism, an early form of hypnotism, was another popular Victorian medical treatment. Practitioners claimed they could cure illness by manipulating animal magnetism, an invisible force they believed flowed through all living things. Mesmerists would wave their hands over patients, stare into their eyes, and perform various mystical gestures, claiming these actions could cure everything from blindness to madness. Some mesmerists performed surgery on patients who were supposedly in mesmerized trances, claiming the patients felt no pain. These operations were incredibly dangerous, as the anesthesia provided by mesmerism was entirely psychological and often ineffective. The popularity of phrenology and mesmerism reveals how desperate Victorian people were for medical treatments that didn't involve the painful and dangerous interventions of regular medicine. Unfortunately, while these alternative treatments were generally less harmful than mainstream medicine, they were also completely ineffective. Victorian medical treatment of women reveals the era's profound gender biases and misconceptions about female physiology. Doctors believed that women were inherently weaker and more prone to mental instability than men, leading to medical practices that reflected and reinforced these prejudices. The concept of female hysteria dominated Victorian gynecology. Doctors attributed virtually any unexplained symptom in women to hysteria, including anxiety, depression, irritability, loss of appetite, and any behaviour deemed inappropriate for a proper Victorian lady. The treatment for hysteria often involved confining women to bed rest for weeks or months, during which they were forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any stimulating activities. Some doctors prescribed hysterectomies, or the surgical removal of women's ovaries, as treatments for hysteria, believing that removing the reproductive organs would cure mental instability. These operations were performed without proper anesthesia or antiseptic techniques, and many women died from infections or complications. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly dangerous for Victorian women. Doctors had little understanding of prenatal care, and many believed that pregnant women should avoid exercise, fresh air, and nutritious food. They prescribed bloodletting for pregnant women showing any signs of vitality, believing that excess energy was dangerous for both mother and child. During labour, Victorian doctors often intervened with forceps hooks and other instruments that frequently caused severe injuries to both mothers and babies. They believed that the natural process needed medical assistance, and that pain during childbirth was a necessary consequence of Eve's sin, rather than something to be minimised. Maternal mortality rates were shockingly high, with many women dying from childbed fever, puerperal sepsis, caused by doctors who moved from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands. When Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis suggested that doctors should wash their hands between patients to prevent infections, he was ridiculed by the medical establishment and eventually driven to a mental breakdown. Despite the horrors described above, the Victorian era also saw the gradual emergence of scientific medicine that would eventually revolutionise healthcare. The work of researchers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in proving the germ theory of disease began to challenge the humoral theory that had dominated medicine for millennia. The introduction of anaesthesia in the 1840s transformed surgery from a desperate last resort into a viable medical option. Initially, many doctors resisted using anaesthesia, believing that pain was necessary for healing or that anaesthetics were tools of the devil. But gradually its benefits became undeniable. Joseph Lister's promotion of antiseptic surgery in the 1860s began to reduce infection rates, though many surgeons initially rejected his ideas. The gradual acceptance of germ theory led to improved sanitation in hospitals and better hygiene practices among medical professionals. The development of more accurate diagnostic tools also began during the Victorian era. The stethoscope, invented in 1816, became widely used for diagnosing heart and lung conditions. Improved understanding of anatomy through more widespread dissection led to better surgical techniques. However, these advances came slowly and were often resisted by the medical establishment. Many doctors continued to practice traditional bloodletting and purging well into the late Victorian era, even as evidence mounted that these treatments were harmful. The Victorian era represents a crucial transition period in medical history, a time when traditional practices based on superstition and ancient theories began giving way to scientific medicine based on observation and experimentation. However, this transition was slow and uneven, and many patients suffered and died from medical treatments that were worse than useless. The horrors of Victorian medicine serve as a reminder of how dangerous medical arrogance can be. Victorian doctors were supremely confident in their treatments, even when those treatments were killing their patients. They dismissed criticism and clung to theories that had no scientific basis, sometimes violently rejecting new ideas that challenged their beliefs. Modern medicine has learned important lessons from Victorian medical failures. The emphasis on evidence-based practice, controlled clinical trials, and careful monitoring of treatment outcomes helps prevent a return to the dangerous practices of the past. The Victorian era's medical disasters also highlight the importance of medical regulation, professional standards, and ongoing education for healthcare providers. Perhaps most importantly, the Victorian medical experience demonstrates the need for humility in medical practice. The history of medicine is littered with treatments that were once considered effective, but are now known to be harmful. This should remind modern medical practitioners to remain open to new evidence and willing to change practices when better treatments become available. The Victorian era's medical horrors remind us that good intentions are not enough in medicine. Rigorous scientific testing and a willingness to abandon ineffective treatments are essential for protecting patient welfare. The patients who suffered through bloodletting, mercury poisoning, and surgical operations without anesthesia deserve to be remembered, and their suffering should motivate continued improvements in medical care. When you next visit a modern doctor's office, take a moment to appreciate the antibiotics, anesthetics, diagnostic equipment, and evidence-based treatments available today. These advances represent the hard-won lessons of centuries of medical trial and error, much of it error that cost countless lives but eventually led to the remarkable medical care we have today. Part 5, The Birth of Written Language, from cave scratches to digital text. You're holding in your hands right now, or looking at on a screen, one of humanity's greatest achievements, written language. These symbols you're reading seem so natural, so obvious, that it's easy to forget they represent something absolutely revolutionary in human history. Before written language, all knowledge died with the people who held it. Stories lasted only as long as memory. Laws existed only in the minds of rulers. The invention of writing didn't just change how we communicate, it changed what it means to be human. For tens of thousands of years, humans communicated through speech gesture and simple visual markers. Our ancestors could build tools, create art, and develop complex social structures, but every piece of knowledge had to be passed down through direct human contact. When an elder died, entire libraries of information died with them. Early humans did leave marks. Cave paintings notched bones, carved symbols, but these weren't writing in any recognizable sense. They were representations, memory aids, or simple record-keeping devices. A notched bone might track the phases of the moon or the number of animals killed in a hunt, but it couldn't capture abstract ideas or complex narratives. The limitation of purely oral culture was profound. Languages drifted and changed rapidly without written standards. Stories evolved with each telling. Knowledge was fragile, dependent on unbroken chains of human memory stretching back generations. One disruption, a plague, a war, a migration, could wipe out centuries of accumulated wisdom. Imagine trying to build a complex civilization without writing. How would you preserve laws that everyone could refer to? How would you maintain accurate records of debts, trades, or land ownership? How would you pass down precise technical knowledge about engineering or medicine? How would you coordinate activities across vast distances or extended periods? The world before writing was necessarily small, immediate, and personal. Everything depended on face-to-face communication and human memory. Knowledge was power because it was so easily lost. The person who remembered the location of water sources, the timing of seasons, or the genealogies of families held tremendous influence over their community. But around 5,000 years ago in the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, humans made a breakthrough that would transform civilization forever. They began to use symbols not just to represent objects or quantities, but to capture the very sounds of speech itself. In the ancient city of Uruk, around 3200 BCE, accountants and administrators faced a growing problem. As the city expanded and trade networks spread, keeping track of goods, debts and transactions using simple token systems was becoming impossible. Someone needed to develop a better way to record information, and so humanity stumbled toward its first writing system. The earliest written documents weren't epic poems or philosophical treatises, they were receipts. Clay tablets covered with simple pictographs recorded quantities of grain, livestock and other goods. A drawing of a sheep next to some tally marks might indicate that someone owned 5 sheep. A stylized ear of grain could represent wheat or bread. But pictographs had severe limitations. They could represent concrete objects but struggled with abstract concepts. How do you draw justice or yesterday or because? How do you record the difference between the sheep and sheep in general? How do you capture the nuances of spoken language, verb tenses, relationships between ideas, emotional content? The breakthrough came when scribes realized that symbols could represent sounds rather than just objects. A pictograph of a bee could represent not just the insect, but also the sound bee, which could then be used in words like believe or before. This rebus principle, using pictures to represent sounds, was the key insight that transformed simple record-keeping into true writing. Mesopotamian scribes developed this system of sound symbols into cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay. Cuneiform evolved rapidly from a few hundred pictographs to a complex writing system capable of expressing any thought that could be spoken. Creating cuneiform tablets was laborious work. Scribes had to prepare clay to exactly the right consistency, shape it into tablets, and carefully press the stylus at precise angles to create clear, readable marks. The tablets then had to be dried or fired to preserve them. Despite these challenges, cuneiform spread throughout Mesopotamia and was adapted to write several different languages. The impact was immediate and profound. Suddenly humans could preserve information with perfect accuracy across unlimited time periods. Laws could be written down for all to see, like Hammurabi's famous code carved in stone around 750 BCE. Literature could be preserved for posterity. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great written epic, has survived for over 4,000 years. Business became more sophisticated when transactions could be recorded precisely. Long-distance trade flourished when contracts could be written and enforced. Knowledge accumulated faster when each generation could build exactly on what came before, rather than relying on imperfect oral transmission. The invention of cuneiform marked the beginning of history itself. Before writing, we have only archaeology to tell us about the past. After writing, we have the actual words and thoughts of ancient peoples preserved in clay for millennia. While Mesopotamians were developing cuneiform, the Egyptians created their own writing system with a very different character. Egyptian hieroglyphics emerged around 3100 BCE, possibly influenced by contact with Mesopotamian traders, but developed along distinctly Egyptian lines. Hieroglyphics combined the representational clarity of pictographs with the phonetic flexibility of sound symbols, creating one of history's most visually striking writing systems. Unlike the abstract wedges of cuneiform hieroglyphics retained their pictorial quality. You could often guess the meaning of a hieroglyph just by looking at it. But hieroglyphics were far more sophisticated than simple picture writing. The system included ideograms, symbols representing ideas, phonograms, symbols representing sounds, and determinative symbols that clarified meaning. The same symbol might function differently depending on context. A drawing of an eye could represent the organ itself, the concept of sight, or the sound eye. Egyptian scribes developed 3 related writing systems: formal hieroglyphics for monumental inscriptions, hieratic script for religious texts, and finally demotic script for everyday documents. Each represented a different level of formality and complexity, adapted to specific uses and social contexts. Learning to read and write hieroglyphics required extensive education. Scribes trained for years to master the hundreds of symbols and complex rules governing their use. This created a powerful scribal class that controlled access to written knowledge and served as intermediaries between the literate elite and the largely illiterate population. The Egyptians used hieroglyphics primarily for religious and administrative purposes. Temple walls were covered with sacred texts designed to guide the pharaoh through the afterlife. Administrative documents recorded tax collections, legal decisions, and trade agreements. Personal letters, though rare, provide glimpses into daily life in ancient Egypt. Perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptians believed that hieroglyphics were the sacred writing of the gods themselves. They called them words of God and believed that writing had divine power. The act of writing someone's name was thought to give them eternal life, while erasing their name could destroy them in the afterlife. This sacred quality gave written language tremendous psychological and cultural power. The preservation of hieroglyphic texts on stone monuments and in tombs allowed modern scholars to decode the writing system after it had been forgotten for over 1,000 years. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, with the same text written in hieroglyphics, Demotic and Greek, provided the key that unlocked ancient Egyptian civilization for modern archaeology. While cuneiform and hieroglyphics were sophisticated writing systems, they remained complex and difficult to learn. Cuneiform required mastery of hundreds of symbols. Hieroglyphics demanded knowledge of even more. These systems kept literacy restricted to a small class of professional scribes and educated elites. The next great breakthrough in writing came from an unlikely source. Semitic-speaking peoples living on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean around 1700 BCE. These early alphabetic systems represented a radical simplification. Instead of hundreds of complex symbols, they used just a few dozen simple signs, each representing a single sound. The key insight was that all spoken language could be broken down into a small set of basic sounds, phonemes. By creating a symbol for each of these sounds, any word in the language could be written using combinations of these symbols. This was far more efficient than systems that required separate symbols for every word or concept. The earliest alphabetic writing, sometimes called Proto-Semitic script, showed clear influence from Egyptian hieroglyphics, but radically simplified the system. A hieroglyphic symbol for a house was simplified into a basic outline and used to represent the H sound based on the Semitic word for house bayet. The Phoenicians, master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, adopted and refined this alphabetic system around 1200 BCE. Being merchants, they needed a writing system that was easy to learn and use for recording transactions across different languages and cultures. The Phoenician alphabet was perfect for their needs. Simple, efficient, and adaptable. As Phoenician traders spread across the Mediterranean, they carried their alphabet with them. Different peoples adapted the Phoenician letters to write their own languages, making modifications to accommodate different sounds and linguistic structures. This process created the ancestor of virtually all modern alphabetic writing systems. The Greeks made a crucial innovation when they adapted the Phoenician alphabet around 800 BCE. Semitic languages like Phoenician were written without vowels. Readers were expected to supply the vowel sounds from context. Greek, however, had more complex vowel systems that couldn't be easily inferred, so the Greeks used some Phoenician consonant symbols to represent vowels instead. This Greek innovation, explicitly writing both consonants and vowels, made reading much easier and more precise. Greek writing could represent the sounds of speech with unprecedented accuracy, making it accessible to far more people than previous writing systems. The democratizing effect of the alphabet was profound. For the first time in history, ordinary people could realistically learn to read and write. Literacy was no longer the exclusive domain of professional scribes. This opened up new possibilities for trade governance and cultural expression. The Romans adapted the Greek alphabet to write Latin, making further modifications to suit their language. They added some letters, dropped others, and standardized the forms that became the basis for most modern European writing systems. More importantly, the Romans spread literacy and standardized writing throughout their vast empire. Roman law required written documentation for many legal transactions. Roman administration depended on written records for everything from census data to military logistics. Roman education, though limited to the upper classes, emphasized reading and writing as essential skills. This created a more literate society than had existed anywhere before. The Romans also developed new materials and technologies for writing. While earlier civilizations had written on claystone or papyrus, the Romans perfected the use of parchment made from animal skins and began experimenting with paper imported from China. They developed better inks, improved pens, and created the codex, a book format with pages bound together rather than rolled up as scrolls. The codex was a revolutionary improvement over scrolls. While a scroll had to be unrolled to find specific passages, a codex allowed readers to flip directly to any page. This made books much more practical for reference and study. The codex format we use today for books directly descends from Roman innovations. Roman literary culture produced works that defined Western civilization for millennia. Virgil's Aeneid established the epic tradition in Latin literature. Ovid's poetry influenced countless later writers. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars demonstrated the power of prose for historical narrative. Cicero's speeches and letters set standards for eloquence and political discourse. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West didn't destroy literacy, but it certainly reduced it. With the breakdown of centralized education and administration, fewer people learned to read and write. Much knowledge was preserved in monasteries where monks laboriously copied manuscripts by hand, preserving classical texts through the Dark Ages. However, Roman legal traditions and Latin continued to influence European writing for centuries. Legal documents, scientific treatises, and religious texts were often written in Latin well into the modern era. The Roman alphabet became the foundation for writing systems throughout Europe and eventually the Americas. During the medieval period, writing remained primarily the domain of the church and nobility. Monks in scriptoriums, writing rooms, copied religious texts and classical works by hand, creating illuminated manuscripts decorated with elaborate artwork. Each book represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, making books incredibly expensive and rare. A single handwritten Bible could cost as much as a farm. Only the wealthiest individuals and institutions could afford substantial libraries. Most people went their entire lives without owning a single book. Knowledge was literally worth its weight in gold. The medieval period saw important innovations in writing technology. The development of better paper-making techniques imported from China via the Islamic world provided a cheaper alternative to expensive parchment. Improved inks and better pen designs made writing faster and more reliable. Universities emerging in the 12th and 13th centuries increased demand for books and writing materials. Students needed textbooks. Professors required reference works, and scholars wanted to preserve and share their research. This growing market for written materials encouraged innovations in production techniques. But the real revolution came in the 15th century with Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type printing in Europe. The Chinese had invented movable type centuries earlier, but the technology didn't spread widely. Gutenberg's printing press could produce books far faster and cheaper than hand copying, making written materials accessible to much larger populations. The impact of printing was immediate and dramatic. The Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, demonstrated the technology's potential. Within 50 years, printing presses had spread across Europe, producing thousands of books in multiple languages. For the first time in history, identical copies of text could be mass-produced, ensuring consistent transmission of information. Printing democratized knowledge in ways that fundamentally changed society. Books became affordable for middle-class families. Literacy rates began climbing as more people had access to reading materials. Standardized texts helped regularize spelling and grammar in various languages. The Protestant Reformation was made possible partly by the ability to mass-produce Bibles and religious pamphlets in vernacular languages. Martin Luther's ideas spread rapidly because they could be printed and distributed widely. Without printing presses, religious reform would have remained largely local. The printing revolution also accelerated the advancement of science and scholarship. Researchers could now build directly on each other's work by referencing identical printed texts. Scientific observations and theories could be distributed quickly and accurately across Europe. The accumulation of knowledge accelerated dramatically. The next great transformation in written language came with the development of digital technology in the 20th century. Computers initially used writing systems designed for mechanical typewriters, but gradually developed new capabilities that transformed how we create, store, and share written text. Word processing software liberated writers from the constraints of physical paper and mechanical typing. Text could be easily edited, reorganized, and formatted without retyping entire documents. Spell checkers and grammar checkers reduced errors. The ability to save copy and print documents revolutionized how people worked with text. The internet created new forms of written communication that the inventors of the alphabet could never have imagined. Email replaced traditional letters for many purposes. Websites made vast amounts of information instantly accessible. Search engines allowed people to find specific information in seconds rather than hours or days of library research. Social media platforms created entirely new genres of written communication. Tweets, posts, comments, and messages that blended characteristics of traditional writing with features of spoken conversation. Text messaging developed its own abbreviated language with acronyms, emoticons, and compressed expressions adapted to small screens and quick typing. The digitization of text has made written language more democratic and accessible than ever before. Anyone with internet access can publish their writing to a global audience. Translation software breaks down language barriers. Text-to-speech and speech-to-text technologies make written content accessible to people with various disabilities. Modern search engines have created new ways of organizing and accessing written knowledge. Instead of relying on physical organization systems like library catalogs, we can now search the full text of millions of documents simultaneously. This has fundamentally changed how we research and learn. Artificial intelligence is beginning to blur the lines between human and machine writing. AI systems can now generate coherent text, translate languages, and even write poetry and stories. While these developments raise questions about the nature of creativity and authorship, they also represent the latest chapter in humanity's long relationship with written language. As we look toward the future, written language continues to evolve at an unprecedented pace. Voice recognition technology is becoming so sophisticated that some predict a future where traditional writing might become less important as we interface with computers through speech. However, the unique properties of written text, its permanence, precision, and ability to be carefully edited and crafted, suggest that writing will remain crucial for complex communication. Augmented reality might soon overlay written information onto our physical environment, creating new relationships between text and space. Brain-computer interfaces could eventually allow direct mental composition of text without typing or writing, potentially revolutionizing how we translate thoughts into words. New challenges face written language in the digital age. The speed and informality of digital communication sometimes prioritize quick transmission over careful expression. The vast quantity of written material available online can make it difficult to distinguish reliable sources from misinformation. The echo chamber effects of social media can fragment written discourse into isolated communities with different vocabularies and assumptions. Yet the fundamental power of written language remains unchanged. Writing still allows us to preserve ideas across time, communicate complex thoughts precisely, and build upon the intellectual achievements of previous generations. Every email you send, every text message you write, every document you create participates in this ancient tradition of converting thoughts into symbols that can outlast our physical presence. The journey from the first cuneiform tablets to modern digital text represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. Written language didn't just record human thought, it transformed how we think, allowing us to develop complex legal systems, scientific theories, literary traditions, and philosophical discussions that would be impossible with oral communication alone. Consider what written language has made possible: the preservation of ancient wisdom across millennia, the coordination of complex societies across vast distances, the accumulation of scientific knowledge that builds upon previous discoveries, the creation of literature that captures the full range of human experience, and the development of democratic institutions that depend on written laws and records. Every time you read a book, you're participating in a conversation that spans thousands of years. The words you're reading connect you to ancient Sumerian accountants who first figured out how to capture speech in clay, to Egyptian scribes who believed writing was divine, to Greek philosophers who used the alphabet to explore abstract ideas, to Roman authors who established literary traditions, to medieval monks who preserved knowledge through dark ages, to Renaissance printers who democratized learning, and to modern programmers who created the digital platforms that make this text possible. Written language has also shaped the very structure of human consciousness. The ability to externalize our thoughts in permanent form has allowed us to develop more complex and nuanced ideas. We can revise and refine our thinking in ways that pure oral culture makes difficult. written language has made possible the gradual accumulation of human knowledge that we call civilization. The democratization of writing has been one of history's most powerful forces for social change. When literacy was restricted to priests and scribes, knowledge was power in the most literal sense. The spread of alphabetic writing began to break down these barriers, but it was the printing press that truly democratized information. Today's digital technologies have accelerated this process, making it possible for anyone to become a publisher and reach a global audience. As we reach the end of our journey through time, from the daily terrors of ancient Rome to the betrayal on the Ides of March, from the precision navigation of Polynesian masters to the dangerous delusions of Victorian medicine, and finally to the revolutionary development of written language itself, we've witnessed humanity in all its complexity. These stories remind us that the past wasn't a simpler time, but a crucible of human experience filled with the same hopes, fears, ingenuity, and folly that characterize our own era. The Roman citizen struggling to survive in a collapsing building wasn't so different from us navigating modern urban challenges. The Polynesian navigator reading the subtle language of waves demonstrates the same human drive to explore and discover that sends us to space today. The Victorian doctor, however misguided, shared our desire to heal and help others. What connects all these stories is the thread of human resilience and creativity. Whether facing disease, navigating vast oceans, or developing new ways to preserve knowledge, our ancestors consistently found ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive in circumstances that would challenge us today. The development of written language in particular represents humanity's greatest leap forward, the moment we transcended the limitations of individual memory and began building collective knowledge that could span generations. From those first scratches in Mesopotamian clay to the digital text you're reading now, writing has been the technology that makes all other technologies possible. Perhaps most importantly, these stories teach us humility. The Romans who built an empire couldn't last a day in their own cities. The Polynesians who mastered the Pacific used techniques we've only recently begun to understand. The Victorians who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization practiced medicine that was often worse than the diseases it attempted to cure. We stand on the shoulders of countless generations who struggled, failed, learned, and passed on their knowledge through the medium of written language. Every word we read, every idea we encounter, every piece of wisdom we inherit is part of an unbroken chain, stretching back to those first scribes who looked at sounds and decided they could be captured in symbols. The next time you complain about your daily life, remember the Roman dodging collapsing buildings and human waste. When you trust your GPS, think of the Polynesian navigators crossing thousands of miles with only stars and waves. When you visit a doctor, be grateful you're not facing mercury poisoning as a cure. And when you write anything down, a note, a text, an email, remember that you're participating in humanity's greatest invention, the technology that made civilization itself possible. We wouldn't last a day in ancient Rome, but neither would the Romans last a day in our world. Each era brings its own challenges and innovations. What remains constant is the human spirit, endlessly curious, surprisingly resilient, occasionally foolish, but always striving to understand and improve our condition. The stories we've shared tonight are ultimately about us, who we were, who we are, and who we might become. They remind us that while the circumstances of human life may change dramatically, the fundamental human experience remains remarkably consistent across time and cultures. In the end, these aren't just stories about the past, they're stories about the present told in the eternal human language of narrative, preserved through the miracle of writing and shared across the digital networks that represent the latest chapter in humanity's long conversation with itself. Every civilization has believed it was the pinnacle of human achievement. Every generation has looked back with a mixture of superiority and nostalgia. But perhaps the greatest lesson from our journey through history is that human progress isn't a straight line, but a complex web of advances and setbacks, wisdom and folly, triumph and tragedy. We are all part of this ongoing story, adding our own chapters through the choices we make and the words we write. The conversation that began with cuneiform tablets continues in every blog post, every text message, every book, including this one. What will future historians make of our era? How will they judge our daily lives, our achievements, our blind spots? Perhaps they'll marvel at our technology while shaking their heads at our failures. They'll certainly wonder how we managed to navigate our own challenges, just as we wonder about the Romans, the Polynesians, and the Victorians. But they'll read about us in words. the same technology that has carried human knowledge from ancient Mesopotamia to the digital age. That may be the most remarkable story of all, that in a universe of constant change, we found a way to make thoughts permanent, to share minds across time and space, and to build a collective human memory that grows stronger with each passing generation. The story continues. The next chapter is yours to write.